I'd like to thank John and Chris and JM and Carl Mello for putting together this program. I found I learned a lot throughout this program of these sort of interdisciplinary papers, and I think what we've come together with is a pretty exciting idea of what is coming forward. Today I'm going to talk about work with several excellent colleagues that were put together through this MSI initiative, Ashwani Manga, Robert Palmatier, Suzanne Xu, and Deborah Small. And our paper really looks at a phenomena that is emerging as technological innovations are creating new products, services, and markets that are satisfying enduring consumer needs. So these innovations are creating value for consumers and firms in many ways, but they're also disrupting something that we explore in the paper, psychological ownership, which is the feeling that a thing is mine. And so we're exploring in our paper two key dimensions of this technology-driven evolution of consumption pertaining to psychological ownership. So the first is a shift from legal ownership of private goods to the purchase of temporary access rights to goods and services. So this is involving an unbundling of property rights typically associated with legal ownership, like the right to use or sell or destroy or trade or exchange. And now consumers are exchanging or giving up some of that bundle that for the purchase of a right to use and services for a limited time. So for example, private ownership of a car for many consumers is being replaced with temporary access rights to a ride from a rideshare service. You can think about permanent private ownership of a card, right? If we want to send a birthday greeting, if I want to say happy birthday to John, in the past I might have sent him a physical card. Now I'm sending him a message on Facebook. And you think in the music case, which might be particularly relevant for Jim, in this case, we can think about the private ownership of a record, for example, is being often exchanged for access to platforms that allow streaming of music and video like YouTube. And just to give you a sense of the scope of this kind of exchange, streaming, for example, is now the dominant way that most Americans listen to their music. The second change stems from new technologies replacing solid material goods with liquid experiential goods and services that fulfill a variety of hedonic and utilitarian wants and needs. So you can think about this change as clearest for utilitarian goods like a calculator, but many of the physical goods that we use to facilitate experiences, whether they're a car facilitating a ride, or a card facilitating a birthday celebration, or a record facilitating the musical experience that we're having, the listening experience, are becoming purely experiential now. And each of these kinds of dimensions of change has important consequences, and many modern consumption experiences are affected by both changes. So by both the shift from legal ownership to legal access, and by this shift from material goods to experiences. And here we list a few examples of this shift. So is this bad for consumers? Well, on the whole, consumers benefit from this evolution of consumption. So access-based consumption models and the reduced marginal cost of experiences are making goods and services cheaper, more sustainable, more convenient, and they're providing consumers with access to goods and services that might have been beyond their reach in an older era. So for example, most people could not afford a private car service, but now with ride-sharing platforms, any of us can call a black car or an SUV for a ride to the airport or out for dinner with our family after quarantine is done. But we argue that there's also a hidden cost to these changes. And the hidden cost of this evolution of consumption is the feeling that nothing is really mine, right? So once all of these kinds of solid physical goods that we used to have private ownership for are now more access-based kinds of experiences, we don't have that feeling of individual ownership, that feeling that something is mine for many of the kinds of goods and services that we're using. And you can think about psychological ownership is often thought of as an association or an attachment between a user or an owner and a good. It's typically facilitated by things like physical control or investing time and effort and money into the good or having intimate knowledge of the good. So an extended relationship. And it typically tracks legal ownership in most kinds of models, but it's not the same thing. So there are many things for which we have both legal and psychological ownership, like perhaps our home or the furnishings within it. There are things for which we have psychological ownership. For example, our favorite sports team, right? Or our ideas and theories. And there are things for which many consumers have legal ownership but don't feel psychological ownership. So you may, for example, own stock in a company, but not really feel like you own Alphabet or you own Apple. We argue in the paper that psychological ownership is a very important kind of quality for firms to fight to maintain for consumers, as it has many kinds of value-enhancing features. So it improves the positivity of evaluations, the way we perceive goods and services. It increases how much we're willing to pay for them, and how much we need to be offered to switch to something else. It increases consumer demand, consumer satisfaction, word of mouth, and competitive resistance. And in the paper, what we do is we look at different ways each of these dimensions are creating threats, transfers, and opportunities for psychological ownership. So, for example, in the case of the shift from legal ownership to legal access, we're seeing that shift is threatening psychological ownership through sort of two different kinds of points. One is fractional ownership. So the bundle of property rights typically associated with the good are now being divided among agents holding property rights to use, profit, change, or transfer ownership. Whereas I used to own my car, the right to use it. Now what I'm doing is buying the right to access a car for a brief duration, right? There's a driver who owns the car. There's a passenger who's using the car, and then there's a platform that's profiting from that kind of experience. The second point with regards to the threat of this transfer is impermanence, right? So consumers no longer expect to keep goods, and they assume goods will be returned, and this impairs a psychological shift in a reference point to thinking of the good as being mine. That said, though, we don't just see threats to psychological ownership, we can also see transfers of ownership. So we see there's a transfer of ownership now for many different kinds of private goods that we used to feel were mine to more of a collective sense of ownership where consumer communities feel like the good is ours. And this is reducing the importance of an individual good. So I care less about a particular album, like this particular record is mine, and I care more about the song, right? And this leaves, but it also leaves goods and services open to potential contamination by dissociative group associations, right? So if, white nationalists, for example, start to affiliate themselves with Ayn Rand, consumption of Ayn Rand novels may go down. There's also different kinds of opportunities induced by these kinds of shifts. We see more consumer choice. So consumers can see improved preference matching due to more available options, and this increases their perceived control, and that should increase their perceived psychological ownership for some of the goods they use. And we also see new channels for self-expression. So social media and reputation systems that are integral to this kind of access-based consumption platforms are providing new outlets for social signaling. With the shift from material to experiential goods, we also see threats, transfers, and opportunities. So one threat is intangibility. So as things move from the material realm to more of an experiential realm, consumers are less able to touch, hold, and physically manipulate experiential goods than physical goods. And we also see a reduced evaluability of ownership, right? So it's very hard to decide who owns a ride in a car, right? Or who owns a time in a vacation share. And so that ownership status is harder to determine. With regards to transfers, we see a change in the categorization level at which consumers feel ownership, where, for example, in the past, you might have felt psychological ownership for the particular car that you owned and used. Now consumers may not necessarily feel psychological ownership for the car or for the brand of car in which they're driving, right, or riding. They may feel ownership for the platform in which they're a member. And we also see greater self-identification, right, so as an opportunity. So people tend to integrate experiences more into their self-concept than material goods. I might feel more comfortable saying that I'm a skier, for example, than I own skis. And so this kind of shift from material goods to experiences may facilitate more kinds of identity relevant associations with these kinds of goods and services. And so in the paper, we look at this kind of shift across these two dimensions in three macro marketing trends. We look at it in the sharing economy. We look at it in the context of digitization. And we also look at it in the context of the explosion of personal data. And so we also recommend different kinds of marketing strategies for firms and for academics to research to look at how can we preserve psychological ownership in cases where it's going to be of value to the consumers and to firms. So for example, in the case of fractional ownership, we suggest that people emphasize the liquidity of consumption and economic value. In the case of impermanence, we would suggest that firms extend and guarantee the duration and consistency of consumption experiences. So for example, you could see often arguments for ebooks are made on many of their kinds of benefits to transaction utility, the greater ease and the reduced cost that would be associated with the books. In the case of collective consumption, we suggest that firms develop a sense of object history within consumers, solicit self-investment like reviews and ask them to do things like take out the trash in an Airbnb or fill up a car, for example, in a zip car, and invest in developing consumer communities. So for example, Airbnb now tells you about this space, right? And there's a history that's given along with a space. And you could think about it in the context of Apple Music. We'd tell you more about the album and give you some background about the music that you're listening to. In the case of opportunities, we can certainly increase consumer choice through larger assortment sets and mass customization. And in terms of new channels for self-expression, we can use many tools of social media marketing, access to different kinds of aspirational brands and goods as opportunities for consumers to engage in social signaling. So for example, they can express their affiliation or concern through these kinds of outlets. With regards to the shift from material to experiential goods, when we think about threats of intangibility and invaluability, well, one thing we can do is consumers may not be able to touch and feel and smell the kinds of goods that they're using. We don't have access to that vinyl that we were able to feel before, but we can use different kinds of haptic and consumption, different kinds of interfaces that give control in different ways. And in case of evaluability, we can think about making different kinds of goods indexical connections or reminders of meaningful life experiences. So you can think about in the context of Netflix, we might have more controls over the way that we're watching video on our computers or on our phones than we did from, for example, the DVD through the remote. In the case of digital photographs, for example, our phones may organize them or curate them by days, important events, or the people with whom the photos were taken. With regard to transfers, as categorization levels increase, as the consumer's focus of attention moves from a particular good, perhaps to the brand or to the platform through which it's being consumed, you can think about firms may want to engage in vertical integration, think about more brand alliances at that level, engage in more servitization, relationship marketing, and also engage in intermediary device personalization, like ways to customize phones, laptops, those kinds of experiences. And you can see that some brands have done that, right? So for example, Disney Plus, used to be able to watch Disney movies on Netflix. Disney Plus has moved most of their content to their own platform where they show this kind of vertical integration and exactly this kind of brand alliances and co-branding. And last, in terms of opportunities with greater self-identification, you might want to leverage identity marketing to offset some of the kinds of loss of psychological ownership. So we can make things more identity relevant in different kinds of ways. So for example, using different kinds of marketing themes that would touch on values that are important to consumers. So we spend the majority of the paper looking at cases where firms should seek to maintain or hold on, prevent the loss of psychological ownership through these kinds of consumption changes. But we do also note that there are cases both for consumers and for firms where they both may wish to avoid preserving psychological ownership. And you could think about, from the consumer-facing perspective, consumers may not want to feel ownership for goods that are identity incongruent. So for example, if environmentalism or sustainability is particularly important to me, I might not want to feel ownership for the large SUV that I rent to take my family to the airport, right? Or consumers may not necessarily want to feel psychological ownership for their questionable browsing history, right? They may think about their personal data as theirs, but they may not want to own that personal data in cases where it may be embarrassing or taboo. Consumers may also not want to avoid psychological ownership in cases where possession is going to be short-term. So where I'm going to use something and I would have to give it away. And so giving away might feel like a loss to me. And so I might actually prefer not to own something in that kind of context. So you might think about something you rent for your child or something that they're going to grow out of very quickly might be more appealing to not feel psychological ownership for, given that it's going to have a fixed duration. You could also think about cases where consumers may not want psychological ownership is when a good is going to remind them of a bad memory or obscure a good memory as well, right? So for example, consumers may not want to have a memento of the current pandemic, right? We're not going to keep our masks afterwards, right? As a reminder, because people don't want to associate that with an important, meaningful time in their life. And a last case that we identify for consumers is for shared goods. So both from the consumer side of the user, right? So users may not want to feel psychological ownership for the Airbnb in which they stay, given that so many other people are staying in it. And also the person who owns the Airbnb, if it's a private owner, may not want to feel like that's theirs if they're lending it to all of these hundreds of people who are going to sleep in their bed. From the firm side, we think that there's some cases where firms may not wish to preserve psychological ownership. So for example, when change in access is likely. So Microsoft, for example, ended its ebooks program and it ended up refunding all of the ebooks that were purchased to consumers. And so that kind of shift where consumers expected to own these kinds of books, in many cases, consumers are very confused about what kinds of rights they've purchased when they buy digital books and music. And so consumers may, in those kinds of cases, firms may wish to suppress psychological ownership so consumers don't feel like something's been stolen from them or taken from them when they lose access to it. We could think that firms may want to suppress psychological ownership when personal data of the consumers is the product. So for example, Facebook may not want you to start charging them for the advertising that they're selling to you. When psychological ownership creates frictions in markets, right? So if I have a particular feeling of ownership for the Volvo that I might subscribe to, and that's not necessarily available, or Volvo needs to swap it out with a different car. If I have strong psychological ownership for the car I'm using, I may feel like that's unfair or maybe more concerned about that kind of service than if I didn't feel psychological ownership for the car. And also when there's inconsistent service quality. So psychological ownership should increase both the value of a particular good or service, and it should also increase people's perception of the quality of that good or service. But that's going to set high expectations. And we know from consumer satisfaction that expectations are a critical point or reference point by which these kinds of experiences and goods are judged. And so the paper talks about these issues and a lot of really exciting research directions that stem from it. Questions like, when psychological ownership declines for goods and services, where does it go? Do we suddenly feel greater ownership for the devices like our phones, right, that we're using to access these goods? Or does it sort of float away into the ether? Does it get more concentrated in the physical goods that we own? And it talks about how these kinds of issues may touch on many other kinds of dimensions or many other kinds of macro marketing trends. We explore 3 in the paper for the purpose of trying to get really into the weeds on them. But there's certainly lots of areas to which it could extend as well. Particularly now, you could think about remote work as being an example that is like a critical combination of both of these issues. I'd like to thank you and thank John and Chris and Carl for prompting us to put this piece together and think through these interesting problems. And if you're interested, I think Matt's going to put the link in for the paper where you can access it through JM. Thank you.